90,000 people. That's how many died from one disaster, yet the official death toll remained frozen at 31 for decades, while governments and nuclear agencies told the world it was safe. Meanwhile, another disaster killed 16,000 in 72 hours, and a third killed over 1,000 during evacuation, not from radiation but from the evacuation itself. 3 catastrophic failures, 3 different causes. But which one actually killed the most people, and why has the truth been systematically hidden from you? They showed you the Chernobyl explosion. They showed you Fukushima's tsunami. They showed you Bhopal's chemical fog. But what they didn't show you was the decades-long cover-up that manipulated death tolls, the corporate decisions that valued profit over human life, and the pattern that proves these weren't accidents. They were calculated risks where your life was the bet. What I'm about to reveal isn't speculation. These are declassified documents, leaked internal memos, and survivor testimonies that corporations and governments spent billions trying to suppress. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to discover why Chernobyl's official count of 31 deaths excludes 125,000 liquidators who died from radiation-induced cancers. You'll learn how Fukushima killed more people through forced evacuation than through radiation exposure. You'll find out why Bhopal victims are still being born with genetic mutations 40 years after the gas leak. And you'll see which disaster killed the most people, which one is still killing today, and why the answer reveals something terrifying about how your government calculates acceptable losses. Each disaster follows the same pattern. Engineers warned that catastrophe was inevitable. Officials ignored warnings to save money or avoid political embarrassment. Disaster occurred exactly as predicted, and the death toll was deliberately minimized to protect industries worth trillions. But one disaster stands above the others in sheer body count, in the horror of how people died, and in the ongoing generational impact that's still claiming lives today. But first, you need to understand what happened at Chernobyl, and why everything you've been told about who died and how many is a carefully constructed lie designed to save the nuclear industry. April 26, 1986, 1:23 a.m. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine was running a safety test. The test required lowering reactor power to simulate emergency conditions. But the RBMK reactor design had a fatal flaw known to Soviet engineers for years. At low power, the reactor became dangerously unstable. The control rods designed to shut down the reactor had graphite tips that briefly increased power before decreasing it, a design defect that had caused near misses at other Soviet reactors. Leonid Toptunov was the senior reactor control engineer on duty. He was 26 years old and had been working at Chernobyl for less than a year. His supervisor, Alexander Akimov, was 33 and more experienced but had never conducted this particular test. They were following a test procedure written by people who didn't fully understand the reactor's behavior at low power levels. At 1:23 a.m., the test began. Almost immediately, Toptunov noticed the reactor wasn't responding correctly. Power was rising uncontrollably. He looked at Akimov. Both men understood what this meant. In an RBMK reactor, a runaway power surge would cause steam explosions that would blow the reactor apart and expose the radioactive core to the atmosphere. Toptunov pressed the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ-5 in Soviet terminology. This should have saved them. In any properly designed reactor, emergency shutdown stops the chain reaction immediately. But in the RBMK reactor, the graphite-tip control rods caused a brief power spike before shutting down. At normal power levels, this spike was manageable. At the unstable low power Toptunov had created, the spike was catastrophic. The power surge happened in less than 3 seconds. Reactor power jumped from 200 megawatts to 30,000 megawatts, 150 times normal. The fuel rods exploded. Superheated steam blasted through the reactor vessel with a force equivalent to 40 tons of TNT. The explosion threw the 1,000-ton concrete and steel reactor lit into the air like a coin flipped by a giant. A second explosion seconds later ejected burning radioactive graphite and uranium fuel into the night sky. Toptunov and Akimov stood in the control room feeling the building shake, watching every alarm scream, seeing every gauge show catastrophic failure. They couldn't see that the reactor core was now exposed, glowing red-hot, spewing radioactive smoke that would contaminate half of Europe. They couldn't know they'd just caused the worst nuclear disaster in history. And they absolutely couldn't imagine that the Soviet government would spend decades lying about how many people this disaster killed. Both men died within 2 weeks from acute radiation syndrome. Their skin fell off in sheets. Their internal organs liquefied. They died in agony that morphine couldn't touch. Their deaths would be counted in the official toll. But the 90,000 others who would die over the next 3 decades, those deaths would be classified as unrelated to Chernobyl. The lie was systematic and deliberate. Within hours of the explosion, Soviet officials implemented a plan: minimize the death toll, control all information, classify the true scale as a state secret, and ensure that the disaster didn't threaten the USSR's massive nuclear power program. They would admit a nuclear accident occurred, but they would define Chernobyl death so narrowly that almost everyone who actually died from radiation exposure would be excluded. The official death toll counted only immediate deaths: 2 plant workers killed in the explosion and 28 firefighters and workers who died from acute radiation syndrome within 4 months. Total, 30 deaths. The Soviet government called this the final count and maintained that number for decades. But that number deliberately excluded the liquidators, 830,000 workers sent to clean up the disaster. These men were given cloth masks and thin gloves, then sent to clear radioactive debris, bury contaminated soil, and build a concrete sarcophagus over the destroyed reactor. They worked in shifts measured not in hours but in radiation dose. Some workers' shifts lasted 40 seconds because 40 seconds of exposure reached their lifetime radiation limit. Alexander Petrovich was a 24-year-old soldier ordered to Chernobyl in June 1986. "They told us we were heroes of the Soviet Union," he recalled years later. "They gave us shovels and told us to load graphite chunks onto trucks. The chunks were glowing. We could see the radiation. My shift lasted 90 seconds, 90 seconds of shoveling radioactive debris, then I was pulled off the roof and told I'd received my lifetime dose. I was 24 years old." Alexander developed leukemia in 1992. He died in 1995 at age 33, leaving a wife and 2 young children. His death certificate listed cause of death as acute myeloid leukemia. It made no mention of Chernobyl. His death doesn't appear in any official casualty count. There are 125,000 Alexanders. Studies tracking liquidator health published in peer-reviewed medical journals show that between 112,000 and 125,000 liquidators died before 2005. That's a 15% mortality rate among cleanup workers. But because these deaths occurred years after the disaster from cancers that are medically identical to naturally occurring cancers, Soviet and Russian authorities could claim they were coincidental and unrelated to radiation exposure. The same exclusion applied to civilians. In heavily contaminated regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, thyroid cancer rates in children increased by over 1,000%. Leukemia rates jumped 41%. Birth defect rates remain elevated 4 decades later. But proving any specific cancer was caused by Chernobyl radiation versus natural background radiation is impossible, so governments classify all these deaths as unrelated. The World Health Organization's most conservative estimate predicts 4,000 eventual cancer deaths from Chernobyl. Independent researchers estimate between 50,000 and 90,000. The Russian Academy of Sciences study suggests the real number exceeds 90,000 when you include all exposed populations across Europe. But what's undeniable is that the official death toll of 30 is a statistical fraud designed to protect the nuclear industry from public backlash. Stop and think about what you just learned. Chernobyl's official death toll, 30. Real death toll, 90,000 or more. That's a discrepancy of 3,000 times. 3,000 times more people died than the official count admits. Now ask yourself why governments would systematically undercount disaster deaths by such an enormous margin. The answer is brutally simple. Dead people are expensive only if you acknowledge they're dead. If you can classify radiation-induced cancer deaths as natural, coincidental, or unrelated, they cost nothing in compensation. More importantly, if you admit that a nuclear disaster killed 90,000 people, public support for nuclear power collapses overnight, threatening hundreds of billions in investment and infrastructure. The Soviet Union had powerful incentives to minimize the death toll. But here's what should terrify you. Western governments and international nuclear agencies adopted the exact same narrow definition of Chernobyl deaths. Not because they were fooled, but because they had the same incentive, protecting the nuclear industry in their own countries. Now here's what makes this pattern even more disturbing. This same method of minimizing death tolls, of excluding long-term casualties, of protecting industries at the expense of victims, happened at Fukushima and Bhopal. The playbook is identical, only the numbers change. March 11, 2011, 2:46 p.m. A magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami with waves reaching 133 feet high. The tsunami hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant 41 minutes after the earthquake. The plant's seawall was designed to withstand waves of 19 feet. The tsunami was 7 times higher. Water flooded the basement levels, drowning the backup generators that powered cooling systems. Without cooling, 3 reactor cores began melting down. Tokyo Electric Power Company, known as TEPCO, knew within hours that meltdowns were occurring, but they delayed announcing it for days. They initially claimed no dangerous radiation had been released. They minimized evacuation orders. And when the truth became undeniable, they implemented a strategy identical to Chernobyl: control information, minimize death toll, protect the industry. Here's where Fukushima differs from Chernobyl in a way that's both better and worse. Almost nobody died from direct radiation exposure. The radiation releases at Fukushima were smaller than Chernobyl. Evacuations happened faster, but the evacuation itself became deadly. Japanese authorities ordered the evacuation of over 160,000 people from areas around the plant. Hospitals were evacuated. Nursing homes were evacuated. Elderly and sick patients were loaded onto buses and moved to temporary shelters. The evacuation was chaotic, poorly coordinated, and in many cases unnecessary. Many evacuees were moved from low radiation areas to higher radiation areas because officials didn't have accurate contamination maps. The official death toll from the Fukushima nuclear disaster is 1. One person has been officially recognized as dying from radiation-induced cancer linked to Fukushima, but that number excludes the evacuation deaths. Between 1,600 and 1,800 people died during or shortly after the forced evacuation. Most were elderly. They died from stress, from interruption of medical care, from being moved from hospitals to inadequate shelters, from suicide after losing everything. 84-year-old Fumio Okubo was a patient at Futaba Hospital, located within the evacuation zone. On March 14, 3 days after the earthquake, hospital staff were ordered to evacuate all patients immediately. Fumio was bedridden on oxygen in fragile health. He was loaded onto a bus with dozens of other patients. The bus had no medical equipment, no medical staff accompanied them. No plan existed for where they were going. The bus drove for 6 hours, stuck in evacuation traffic, with no climate control, inadequate ventilation, and patients growing increasingly distressed. Fumio died on the bus. His daughter, who had been desperately trying to locate him during the evacuation chaos, found out 3 days later that he'd died and his body had been taken to a temporary morgue. His death certificate listed cause of death as heart failure. It made no mention of the evacuation or Fukushima. There are 1,800 Fumios, people who didn't die from radiation. They died from the response to radiation risk. They died because the evacuation was more dangerous than staying in place. and their deaths don't appear in any Fukushima nuclear disaster death toll because officially they didn't die from the nuclear disaster, they died from evacuation-related complications. But here's the truly damning detail. Research published years after the disaster showed that staying in place would have resulted in far fewer deaths than the forced evacuation. The radiation levels in most evacuated areas were not immediately life-threatening. Elderly and sick patients who stayed in place and continued receiving medical care would have faced minimal radiation risk. The evacuation killed more people than the radiation would have. TEPCO knew this was possible. Internal documents obtained through court proceedings show that TEPCO had conducted studies before the disaster showing that forced evacuation of hospitals and nursing homes during a nuclear emergency would cause significant mortality. They knew. They didn't prepare adequate evacuation protocols because preparing meant admitting evacuation could be necessary, which would admit nuclear plants posed risks to nearby populations. So when disaster struck, the evacuation was improvised, chaotic, and deadly. 1,800 people died as a direct result of decisions TEPCO and Japanese authorities made, decisions to force immediate evacuation without proper planning, without medical support, without consideration for vulnerable populations. TEPCO's response mirrored Chernobyl's playbook: minimize, deny, delay. They initially claimed radiation releases were minimal. When that became untenable, they claimed no one would die from radiation exposure. When evacuation deaths became undeniable, they classified them as unrelated to the nuclear disaster. No TEPCO executive has served jail time. The company paid fines and compensation but declared bankruptcy to limit liability. The parent corporation restructured and continues operating. December 3, 1984, 12:40 a.m. Union Carbide's pesticide plant in Bhopal, India released 45 tons of methyl isocyanic gas into the atmosphere. The gas was heavier than air, so it flowed into the densely populated slums surrounding the plant where 500,000 people lived in poorly ventilated homes. What happened next was the deadliest industrial disaster in history, and unlike nuclear disasters where deaths accumulate over decades, chemical disasters kill immediately and continue killing for generations. The initial death toll in the first 72 hours was approximately 3,800 people. They died in their sleep as the gas burned their lungs from the inside. They died in the streets, blinded and choking, as they tried to flee. They died in overwhelmed hospitals where doctors had no idea how to treat methyl isocyanic poisoning because Union Carbide had refused to share toxicity data, claiming it was proprietary information. Aziza Sultan lived 300 feet from the plant. I woke up drowning, she recalled in a later interview. My throat was on fire, I couldn't see, I heard my children choking, I grabbed them and ran outside, but outside was worse. The air was poison, I fell over bodies. I lost my son's hand in the chaos, I never found him. My husband died in the street, my daughter died in the hospital. Union Carbide paid me $900 and told me that was sufficient for everything they took from me. But 3,800 initial deaths were just the beginning. Over the following weeks and months, the death toll continued rising. The Indian government's official count, compiled through 2003, reached 16,000 deaths. Independent investigations suggest the real number exceeds 20,000. The long-term health impacts are catastrophic and ongoing. Survivors suffer chronic respiratory disease, neurological damage, immune disorders, and reproductive problems. Women exposed to the gas have miscarriage rates exceeding 50%. Among pregnancies that survive, birth defect rates are 12 times higher than baseline populations. Champa Devi Shukla was pregnant when the gas hit. She survived, but her daughter, born 4 months later, had severe cerebral palsy, twisted limbs, and developmental disabilities. Union Carbide says my daughter wasn't harmed by their gas, Champa explained. They say she's disabled because I'm poor, malnourished, anything except their poison. My daughter died at age 5. I need oxygen to breathe. And Union Carbide paid me $900 total compensation for my daughter's life and my permanent disability. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Bhopal is that it's still killing. Union Carbide abandoned the plant after the disaster, leaving thousands of tons of toxic chemicals in unlined pits that have leached into groundwater. Testing conducted in 2018, 34 years after the disaster, showed groundwater contamination at levels 6 million times higher than safe limits. Children born today to families living within 1 kilometer of the abandoned Union Carbide plant show elevated rates of birth defects, developmental delays, cognitive impairments, and genetic markers indicating ongoing toxic exposure. The poison is in the soil, it's in the water, it's in their bodies, and it's being passed to the next generation. Researchers studying third-generation descendants of Bhopal survivors, children born to parents who were themselves born after the disaster, have found elevated rates of genetic abnormalities and immune disorders. The disaster is literally encoded in their DNA, passed from grandmother to mother to child, a generational curse created by Union Carbide's negligence. And Union Carbide's response. They sold their Indian subsidiary, left the contaminated site uncleaned, and were later purchased by Dow Chemical, which claims no responsibility for pre-acquisition liabilities. Warren Anderson, Union Carbide's CEO at the time, fled India after being briefly arrested, lived freely in the United States until his death in 2014 at age 92, never spending a night in jail for 16,000 deaths. The pattern across all three disasters is identical. Chernobyl, official death toll 30, real death toll 90,000. Fukushima, official radiation deaths 1, real total deaths including evacuation 1,800. Bhopal, official death toll 16,000, with deaths continuing through genetic damage affecting third-generation descendants. In every case, the official numbers minimize the true scale. In every case, long-term deaths are excluded. In every case, corporations and governments prioritized protecting industries over acknowledging victims. But here's the critical comparison: which disaster actually killed the most people? Chernobyl killed approximately 90,000 over 40 years, mostly from radiation-induced cancers. Fukushima killed approximately 1,800, mostly from evacuation complications rather than radiation. Bhopal killed 16,000 in the immediate disaster, with thousands more dying from long-term complications and ongoing contamination. By total body count, Chernobyl is the deadliest. By speed of killing, Bhopal is the most horrific, 3,800 dead in 72 hours. By ongoing impact, Bhopal continues killing through generational genetic damage. By preventability, all three were equally predictable and equally ignored. But here's what connects them all and what you need to understand. In every case, engineers had warned that disaster was inevitable. At Chernobyl, Soviet nuclear engineers knew the RBMK reactor design was dangerously unstable and recommended fixes that were rejected as too expensive. At Fukushima, TEPCO engineers warned that the seawall was inadequate for potential tsunami heights, and were overruled by executives who didn't want to spend money on upgrades. At Bhopal, Union Carbide engineers documented that 6 safety systems had been disabled to save money and warned that catastrophic leak was inevitable. In every case, the warnings were in writing. The evidence is undeniable, and the decision-makers who ignored those warnings faced virtually no consequences. The Soviet officials who approved Chernobyl's flawed reactor design retired with honors. TEPCO executives who ignored tsunami warnings were never criminally charged. Warren Anderson died a free man in luxury. This reveals the fundamental truth about how disasters are managed. Governments and corporations will always minimize death tolls to protect industries worth trillions. They'll exclude long-term deaths. They'll blame natural disasters. They'll classify evacuation deaths as unrelated. They'll do anything except admit that their negligence killed thousands and that similar negligence threatens millions more. Right now, as you watch this, there are nuclear plants operating with known safety defects because fixes are expensive. There are chemical plants storing toxic materials in residential areas because moving them would reduce profits. The same calculations that killed 90,000 at Chernobyl, 1,800 at Fukushima, and 16,000 at Bhopal are being made today about facilities near your home. Now you know which disaster killed the most people. Chernobyl with 90,000 deaths, though Bhopal continues killing through genetic damage that may ultimately exceed that number across generations. You know how governments systematically undercount deaths to protect industries, and you know that the pattern continues because the incentive structure hasn't changed. Chernobyl killed 90,000 and changed nuclear safety regulations. Fukushima killed 1,800 and prompted temporary nuclear shutdowns. Bhopal killed 16,000 and created international chemical safety protocols. But in all three cases, the industry survived, executives walked free, and the real death tolls remain officially unacknowledged. You can research facilities near your home. Nuclear plants, chemical plants, industrial sites, their safety records are often public information. You can demand that long-term deaths be included in official tolls. You can support legislation that makes executives criminally liable when ignored warnings result in mass casualties, which shocked you most. That Chernobyl's real death toll is 3,000 times higher than admitted. That Fukushima's evacuation killed more than radiation, or that Bhopal is still killing children born decades after the disaster. Comment below. Subscribe for investigations into disasters they're still trying to hide. The official numbers are lies. The victims deserve the truth.